We've already looked at what caused World War I. Now let's turn our attention to some of the weapons that were used during the war. World War I was another turning point for warfare. Throughout the centuries before World War I, there was the idea that there was a right way and a wrong way for combat to take place. In the Middle Ages, there was the idea of a noble knight who bravely fought for what was right. It was assumed that the knight could do this because he was a shining example of all that was good and noble. On the battlefield, he fought bravely face to face with his enemies. This idea of a noble way to fight battles continued on for many centuries. By the time of World War I, the idea still existed, although it was being challenged as new weapons began to be used in war. World War I would help people to continue asking questions like, is there a noble way to fight a war? And is it cowardly to use a weapon that doesn't rely on fighting face to face? During the war, some nations used these weapons more than others. Often it was the most desperate that did so. Now let's take a look at some of the weapons used in the war and their impact. In the beginning, many soldiers had been excited to march off to war. The idea of the brave knight was alive and well. But by November of 1914, they were having second thoughts. The Germans had used a plan called the Schlieffen Plan to sweep quickly into France. You'll learn more about this plan in the next lesson. However, the initial advantages of the Germans eventually slowed down as the French and other defending countries began digging defensive trenches. Before, in wartime, soldiers would dig trenches to stand in for protection from attacking enemies. In World War I, the trench was used in the same way, but with one big difference: machine guns. World War I was the first war where machine guns were used widely and effectively. As soldiers ran across the empty land between trenches, called no man's land, the enemy would fire machine guns and artillery at them, killing sometimes hundreds of men at a time. Because of this, very few soldiers actually made it all the way to the enemy trenches. Being told by your commanding officer that you and your group of soldiers were going over the top, which meant running from your trench across no man's land and hopefully attacking the enemy if you were still alive, that was a pretty scary thing. So, for a large part of the war, each side had great defensive strategies, but there weren't offensive strategies that worked well. Imagine a football game where the defense on both teams was incredible, but the offense on both teams was weak. Neither team would ever score a point. That's the same problem that happened in World War I. And there's a term for this: stalemate. A stalemate occurs when two opposing forces get to the point where neither one makes much progress against the other. Both sides in the war had dug thousands of miles of defensive trenches, and it became very difficult for one side to force the other to retreat. As a result, millions of European soldiers from both sides were killed, with little ground being gained by either side. By the time American soldiers showed up in 1917, most of the European soldiers that were still alive were worn out and tired of fighting a war that didn't seem to go anywhere. But even if the soldiers had only stayed in their own trenches, there was still danger from a newly developed weapon: poison gas. Once it had been used once, it didn't take long for both sides in the war, the Central Powers and the Allied powers, to start using the gas. Poison gas would be released when the wind was blowing towards the enemy trenches, or canisters of it would be shot and exploded above enemy lines. The gas burned the eyes, noses, and throats of anyone who breathed it. At best, it caused large blisters to erupt on their exposed skin. At worst, it suffocated and killed the soldiers. This is an example of what is called chemical warfare. It was considered so horrible that after World War I, countries around the world agreed not to use it again in warfare. With a few exceptions, most countries have stood by this agreement. Eventually, a new weapon was introduced into the war: the tank. This huge, bulky machine was perfect for rolling through the mud, over barbed wire, and crossing smaller trenches. It also allowed soldiers to have something to hide behind to protect themselves from machine gun fire as they crossed no man's land. Remember how we talked about the idea of honor in combat? Well, one of the most influential weapons of World War I was the submarine. But although many nations had submarines, the Germans used them the most. Why? Because people felt like it was not a noble way to fight. To counter this, at the beginning of the war, submarines would surface near a ship and announce that they were going to blow the ship up. The passengers and crew were allowed to get into lifeboats first, before the ship was then torpedoed and sunk. But later, submarines began to sink ships without any warning. This was viewed as cowardly by many nations, since it relied on hiding and attacking instead of facing your enemy head-on in a fair fight. Today the Air Force is an essential part of any country's military power. But up until World War I, airplanes had never been used in a war. World War I was the first war where airplanes were used in combat. They were mostly used to get an aerial view of enemy lines and movement. This is called reconnaissance. However, as the war progressed, airplanes sometimes began to carry weapons as well. Since airplanes at that point were lightweight, they couldn't carry many weapons. However, each one might carry 1 or 2 small bombs that the pilot could pick up and throw out of the cockpit if he saw an enemy below. During the war, there were also some early bomber airplanes, but even these couldn't carry anything near the amount of weapons that a modern bomber can carry today. Some airplanes were eventually equipped with machine guns as well, allowing them to attack and try to shoot down enemy planes in battles known as dogfights. Fighter pilots were known as aces. Some of the most famous pilots during the war were Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, who fought for the Central Powers, and Eddie Rickenbacker, who fought for the Allies. So let's sum up. The battles and new weapons of World War I challenged centuries-old ideas about the ways to fight a war. Countries had to examine whether there were right and wrong ways to win a battle, or whether just winning was the most important thing. Weapons like the machine gun, tank, poison gas, submarine, and airplane changed the way that wars were fought. In our next lesson, we'll examine some of the key people involved with World War I, as well as some of the decisions that they made that impacted the war.